Director inviting you to stay tuned for a special presentation at this time. This program will tell the story of the Great Marshfield Fire almost 80 years ago. The story was written about 9 years ago by Miss Geraldine Smith of 206 West 3rd Street in Marshfield. She is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. G.R. Smith. Miss Smith is a teacher at Spencer High School, where she teaches English literature and American history. She is a 1958 graduate of Wisconsin State University at Stevens Point and a 1966 graduate of Marquette University. Through research and facts supplied by her grandmother, the late Miss Clara Thomas, who was about 9 years old at the time of the fire, she wrote the story about the Great Marshfield Fire, which occurred back on June 27, 1887. Here is her story. In 1855, the Fox and Wisconsin Improvement Company was established in central Wisconsin for the purpose of improving the Wisconsin and Fox rivers for the government so that steamboat navigation between Green Bay and the Mississippi River would be possible. In return for completing the waterways, the company was granted 700,000 acres of virgin timber for a period of 10 years tax-free. However, the project was a failure. The contract expired and a new company was formed called the Green Bay and Mississippi Improvement Company. The land was subsequently divided among the incorporators, and the immediate area was purchased by John McGee and Samuel Marsh in 1866. Thus, Marshfield had its beginning. Since the village was located in the midst of attractive hardwood timber, it grew very little within the first 6 years of its establishment. It was approachable only through the woods, and since there was no sawmill, the logs had to be hauled to the railroad, where they were shipped to Menasha or De Pere. A sawmill was established at Manville, however, and eventually a road was cut through the woods from Marshfield, a distance of 3.5 miles. In 1871, however, settlement was considerably stimulated with the coming of the Wisconsin Central Railroad to the territory. Construction began and the first train came through on July 4, 1872. Between 4 and 5 million feet of log lumber were now being shipped to Menasha from the local timber company. Marshfield, by this time, had developed into a typical frontier town of the West, as it had been literally carved out of the forest. The community itself was made up mostly of the rough lumbering people who by now numbered about 2,000. The business district consisted of 21 saloons and a few stores, which faced each other across a hard mud road covered with tree stumps. The town was so well supplied with saloons that drunken brawls were not infrequent, and by the late 1870s, 7 murders had been committed, one which had been proven self-defense. This latter case happened when a drunken Indian pulled a knife on a fellow saloon patron and was promptly brained with a pool cue. In 1879, Major William Henry Upham, a veteran of the Civil War and future governor of Wisconsin, came to Marshfield and virtually constructed the business of the town single-handedly by establishing a sawmill and a shingle factory, a general store, a machine shop, a flour mill, the First National Bank, and a 10-mile-long Marshfield and Southern Railroad for the purpose of reaching the surrounding tracts of virgin timber. By 1887, these business enterprises had expanded to the point where the sawmill had a capacity output of 22 million feet of lumber per year. The furniture department was shipping 30 carloads of furniture per month. The flour mill produced 225 barrels per day, and the Upham General Store had become the hub of the mercantile trade in the district. Monday, June 27, 1887, came as a clear, hot day to Marshfield, which by now had become a boom town of some 3,000 inhabitants. Little whirlwinds of dust caused by the rainless 3 weeks swirled along Central Avenue. Everywhere, the men of the community could be seen as they hurried to their work at the Upham lumber yards. The morning passed quickly as the lumber season was in full swing and everyone was very busy. A capacity season had been promised, and already the yard contained over 17 million feet of lumber. By 11:30 a.m., the work had slackened considerably as it was getting close to dinner time. At 11:45, a short blast sounded from the whistle atop the mill, which signaled the teamsters to put the horses into the barns for dinner. Just then, the Wisconsin Central Railway train chugged by the mill and stopped on a spur near the yard to empty its firebox. Suddenly, a fatal spark leaped into the nearby sawdust pile. Smoke arose, and the dreaded cry of fire pierced the air. Immediately, Everett A. Upham, the chief engineer of the mill, sounded the alarm to call out the fire department and prepared to fight the blaze. Members of the volunteer fire department ran about 2 blocks to a shed at the corner of West 3rd and Chestnut Streets where their 2-wheeled hose cart was kept. They quickly connected the only two lines they had to the yard hydrants and cleared away the railroad cars from the burning area, which proved to be a fatal mistake, as it gave the fire a good chance to spread in those few wasted moments. In the excitement, the hydrants were left unattended, and the fire became so fierce the men had to drop their hoses and run for their lives. Consequently, the hoses burned, and the water ran from the hydrants so that the pumps were useless. The men then tried to prevent the fire from spreading by moving the lumber and thus block the flames. However, it became so hot that any further effort in that quarter was useless, and so they withdrew. Everett Upham then cut the lines that connected the pump with the hydrants and single-handedly tried to protect the powerhouse of the mill from the onslaught. By this time, the fire had spread from the lumber piles to the sawmill, which was adjacent to the powerhouse. From here, the burning bits of wood rained down on the Upham mill pond, which at this time was filled to capacity with uncut logs. These huge logs, dried by the terrific heat, caught fire, thus turning the whole pond into a floating mass of flame. The flames, fanned by strong winds, then leaped to the flour mill, whose elevator was filled with 10,000 bushels of wheat. Spontaneous combustion soon caused the elevator to ignite, and the golden grain cascaded down like an avalanche. Men frantically raced into the burning mill and hurriedly salvaged some of the barrels of flour, which they rolled down Chestnut Street to the site of the old Washington School on Central Avenue. In the meantime, Everett Upham was still putting up a losing battle with the flames, as by this time the buildings all around him were burning furiously. Realizing his efforts to be in vain, he filled the boilers with water and viciously slammed the wrench between the levers that controlled the steam pressure. Immediately, the whistle atop the mill began its dismal screech, the symbol of a dying town. Everett Upham then took an old coat hanging on the wall in the engine room, soaked it with water, put it over his head and shoulders. For this protection, he ran between the burning lumber piles into the street. The sky was now filled with a dense black smoke, and meteor-like sparks were flying through the air. Strong air currents, which had been created by the intense heat, lifted burning boards of 12 and 14-foot lengths 1 to 200 feet in the air. The heat was so extreme that it caused the rails of the spur line to twist like taffy and glass window panes to crack everywhere. Indeed, it was so very hot and the sky so black that some of the people thought the day of judgment had arrived. Central Avenue was crowded with people and their teams, all of whom were intent on salvaging what household goods they could carry with them to the safety of the open fields on the edge of the town. Many businessmen hastily snatched their securities from their safes, stuffing them into anything handy in a frenzied attempt to save anything and something from the wind-whipped flames, which in many places were already licking up their merchandise. The goods which the families couldn't take along were set in the open lots around the community, in hopes that the flames would be halted short of them. By now it was apparent that the fire was completely out of control, and in order to save anything, it would be necessary to call in outside help. Mr. M.G. Fleckenstein, who was the assistant depot agent for the Wisconsin Central Railway, ran to the telegraph office and dispatched messages of help to Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls, and Stevens Point. Stevens Point responded to the call with venerable Fire King No. 1. An engine which now stands in the Chicago Museum. Fire King was placed on a railroad flat car and the race to Marshfield began. It took 12 to 16 men to operate the King, which with its two brass cylinders acting as a single action pump could produce from 100 to 125 pounds of water pressure. 43 minutes later, the train bearing the King roared into Marshfield, which, as a town, was fast becoming extinct. Under the direction of Captain Peter Joyce, the engine was set up, but its hoses were too short to reach the only supply of water from the alcohol factory pond, thus rendering it useless. Its crew, however, were immediately put to work extinguishing small blazes and aided the people in carrying their household goods away. By this time, the fire had swept onward across the yards and had jumped Chestnut Street to the newly opened Central House, a fashionable hotel of the times, located on the corner of West Depot Street. As the fire gained headway, it crossed the Sioux Line tracks and burned out that entire section of the town except St. John's Catholic Church, which was saved only through the efforts of a man who extinguished the sparks that rained down on the roof with a pail of water. From the Sioux Line tracks, the fire spread quickly south until the entire block between West 1st and 2nd Streets was a mass of flame. Men now worked frantically with long ropes equipped with swamp hooks in a vain attempt to pull down the buildings which stood in the path of the fire. In this way, they hoped to create a fire lane which would enable them to check the blaze. This procedure was also ineffective, and as a last resort, Major Upham gave the order to use dynamite to try to check the conflagration. At the corner of West 2nd Street and Central Avenue stood Henry Merton's Hotel. Here, a 10-pound dynamite charge was placed on a pool table and set off. The explosion tore away half the building, tossed it up into the air, and dropped it back onto its foundation. In the meantime, at the Upham General Store directly across the street, large, expensive Oriental rugs had been dragged from the building, wet down and placed on the roof. However, all these efforts were futile, too, as the store and all of its valuable contents were soon ablaze. The fire now spread from West 2nd to West 4th Streets along Central Avenue, destroying everything in its path. The flames then leaped across the 100-foot span of Central Avenue, destroying 4 saloons, numerous stores, and the German-American Bank. Still farther up the avenue between East 2nd and East 1st Streets, the conflagration raised more stores and saloons. Upon reaching the Knoll Hardware on the same block, a terrific explosion occurred, as many cases of dynamite had been stored in the basement. The fire was finally brought under control about 4:30 on Monday afternoon, and it was virtually out by 5 p.m. Within its 5 hours of rampage, it had destroyed more than 250 buildings, including almost the entire business section, which now lay in ashes. Every place of business except one, a small general store belonging to Strebler and Steinitz, standing on the corner of East Arnold and Central Avenue, was leveled. Hundreds of the city's inhabitants were left homeless and destitute by the disaster, which, because of his extreme swiftness, had left many people with only the clothes on their backs. It was estimated that the fire had cost Marshfield $4 million. Still, everyone was quite fortunate in that not one life was lost in the blaze that had practically annihilated the property of the entire community. These people had no time to cry over spilled milk, however. By 6 p.m., many were already picking their way through the burned-over prairie of the business district. Immediately afterward, the ringing of a hammer was heard, and Steve Lukey reestablished his saloon in the open air with a sign that has now become famous: Wanted, 1,000 men to unload schooners. A relief agency was established at the roller rink on the corner of East 2nd and Maple Streets, and this building became the receiving center for the many contributions of food, clothing, and money that came in from the different communities throughout the state. Here, under the ever-vigilant, untiring care of the Major's wife, Mary Upham, and Father Richard Schaller, the pastor of St. John's, relief was distributed to the destitute according to their needs. At 6 a.m. the next day, June 28, 1887, Major Upham raised the American flag on the pole directly across the street from his home. Although he had suffered almost $1 million in personal losses, he promised that he would have his sawmill rebuilt in 90 days, thus rendering life to the now dead village. His promise also provided the impetus necessary for a community-wide rebuilding program to begin. Within a few days, the sounds of shovel, hammer, and saw were heard in every quarter of the town. Those who had lost their homes were given enough lumber for a 16 by 24-foot building with 3 windows and 2 doors. Soon, rude shacks were erected in the streets, and from these, the businessmen conducted their affairs. An ordinance was passed banning the construction of permanent wooden buildings in the business district, and the new brick structures, which still stand along Central Avenue today, were erected. Thus, from the ashes of a pioneer village sprang a new city, a city built with the confidence and resolution of a courageous people. And there you have the story of the Great Marshfield Fire, which occurred back on June 27, 1887. The Marshfield Fourscore Committee has organized a Fourscore celebration to be held here in Marshfield June the 28th through July 2nd, with daily observances to be held with a giant parade honoring the history and those who made Marshfield history on Saturday afternoon, July 1st. This has been a public service presentation of WDLB News and Public Affairs Department. This is Bob Burt speaking.